What if the story we were told about Meri Brown was never the whole story, and what she revealed about Robin could change how fans see the catfishing scandal forever? For years, Sister Wives fans have wondered whether the story surrounding Meri Brown's catfishing scandal was really as simple as it appeared on television, and now the conversation has taken another turn because Meri has described details that raise questions about what she was told, what she shared, and who may have known about her. Private conversations at the time, and before we go any further, there is one important distinction because much of what has circulated around this story remains fan speculation and has never been established as fact, but that is exactly why the details are so fascinating. The original story was that Meri became emotionally involved with someone online who presented himself as a successful businessman and later turned out to be a fictional identity created by Jackie Overton, while Meri believed she was communicating with a real person, and Meri has previously explained that she valued the companionship and believed she was building a connection with someone she trusted, while also saying that she believed she understood her own boundaries and did not intend to cross them. But the consequences of the situation became enormous, and the scandal became closely connected with the breakdown of her relationship with Cody for years. Viewers were given a fairly straightforward version of events, and the catfishing episode became one of the biggest explanations for why the marriage deteriorated. But the newer discussion introduces a different question because Meri has described conversations she had with Robin during that period, and according to Meri, she shared private information with Robin and later discovered that details she had discussed with Robin appeared to have reached other people, including the person behind the online identity. Meri said this created a major sense of betrayal because she had trusted Robin with information and even asked her not to continue discussing it, while Robin maintained that she was trying to help the situation. That difference in perspective is where the suspense really begins, because if Meri believed she had shared something privately and then saw pieces of that information appearing elsewhere, she would naturally have questions about how the information traveled. However, the available material does not establish that Robin created the catfishing account or deliberately arranged the deception, and that distinction matters because a dramatic story should not turn an allegation into a proven fact. Instead, the real story is the unresolved question that has kept fans talking for years. How much did each person actually know, and when did they know it? And there is another reason this question continues to attract attention, because the timeline has always fascinated viewers. Meri legally divorced Cody in 2014, and Cody and Robin legally married later that year, while the catfishing scandal became public in 2015, and some fans have interpreted that sequence as suspicious. But timing alone cannot prove that one event caused another, and the original material itself acknowledges that much of the theory comes from fan discussion rather than confirmed evidence. Then there is the connection involving Robin's friend Kendra, which has also been discussed in fan theories and commentary. The theory suggests that Kendra may have had some knowledge of the online relationship and may have reassured Meri that the person she was talking to is real. But again, this is an area where the distinction between documented events and speculation is essential, because the show has not established that Kendra participated in creating or operating the fake identity. What makes the story compelling is that Meri has described feeling that information from her private conversations somehow traveled beyond the people she expected to know about it, and that feeling of betrayal became part of the larger emotional fallout. The more viewers revisit the timeline, the more they begin asking whether the catfishing scandal was really the beginning of the marriage problems, or whether it became the event that made an already damaged relationship impossible to ignore. And that question leads directly into the part of the story that many viewers may have overlooked, because Meri has previously pushed back against the idea that the catfishing incident alone defined the end of her marriage, and has explained that there were already problems before it happened. So perhaps the most important question is not who knew about the online relationship, but what was already happening between Meri and Cody before the scandal ever became public. Because if the marriage was already struggling, then the catfishing incident may have accelerated a breakdown rather than creating it from nothing, and that changes the way the entire timeline can be understood. What makes this story especially powerful is that the unanswered questions are not necessarily about proving a conspiracy, but about understanding how trust disappeared inside a family that was already under enormous pressure. Meri had to deal with the emotional consequences of an online relationship while also dealing with the public reaction and the changing dynamics inside her marriage. And once the scandal became part of the family narrative, it became difficult to separate separate the original event from everything that followed. Cody described being confused about what was happening and said that communication between him and Meri was already difficult, while Meri maintained that she had been navigating a situation she did not fully understand and that she believed she was maintaining her boundaries. Those two perspectives reveal how differently the same period could be remembered by two people who were already struggling to communicate. And this is where the story loops back to the question from the beginning, because fans have spent years asking whether the catfishing scandal was the real reason the marriage ended, or simply the moment when an existing separation became impossible to hide. If Meri is correct that the relationship was already deeply strained, then blaming everything on one scandal would leave out years of context. And if her concerns about private information being shared are accurate, then the emotional impact would have been even more complicated, because the issue would not simply have been an online deception, it would also have involved a loss of trust among people she believed she could confide in. But there is still no confirmed evidence in the material provided that Robin organized the catfishing, or that the wider conspiracy theory is true, and that is exactly where responsible storytelling can make this even more compelling, because instead of telling viewers that a theory has been proven, we can walk through the timeline and let them understand why the theory became so persistent, while also making clear what remains unconfirmed. The result is a story about unanswered questions rather than unsupported accusations, and perhaps that is why the subject continues to generate so much discussion years later, because every time another detail about those conversations comes forward, viewers naturally revisit the same timeline and ask whether they misunderstood the story the first time around. The catfishing scandal became a defining chapter in Meri's life, but it does not necessarily explain every problem that came before it or everything that happened afterward. And the biggest twist may actually be that there may never be one single moment that explains the collapse of a relationship that had been changing for years. Meri's experience shows how quickly private relationship struggles can become public narratives, and once a story becomes part of reality television, it can be almost impossible to separate what was shown, what was said later, and what fans believe happened in the spaces cameras never captured. So as we look back at the timeline, the question remains open. Did the catfishing scandal create the distance between Meri and Cody, or did it simply expose a relationship that was already falling apart? And when Meri says she felt betrayed by information reaching people outside the conversations where she shared it, the question becomes even more complicated, because trust was already fragile, and every new detail forces fans to reconsider the same events from another perspective. And that is the part of this story worth remembering. Not every theory is a fact, not every coincidence is evidence, and not every unanswered question has a simple answer. But the unanswered questions are exactly why this chapter of Sister Wives continues to hold the attention of viewers. And perhaps the biggest revelation is not that one person secretly controlled everything, but that the full story may have been much more complicated than the version audiences first received. And until the people who were actually there provide more definitive answers, the timeline will remain a subject of debate. And that brings us right back to the beginning, because the real mystery is not simply who is behind the catfishing, it is how a marriage that was already struggling reached the point where one online scandal became the event everyone remembered, and everything else became part of the background. But there is another layer to this story that makes the timeline even more complicated, because once Meri began questioning what had happened during the catfishing period, the issue was no longer simply about an online relationship. It became about trust and who she believed she could safely confide in. And according to the material, Meri specifically described conversations with Robin that later made her feel betrayed, because she believed certain private details had somehow traveled beyond that conversation. And this is where viewers need to slow down, because there is a difference between what Meri personally experienced, what she believed happened, and what fans have theorized for years. The available material does not establish that Robin created the fake identity or planned the catfishing, but it does show why Meri's account caused viewers to revisit an old story from a completely different angle. Because if you tell someone something privately and then discover that information appears somewhere else, you are naturally going to question how it happened. And that question becomes even more important when the person you trusted was someone inside your own family. Meri described asking Robin not to continue talking about the situation because she felt the conversations were making things worse, yet Robin believed she was helping, and that disagreement alone reveals how differently the two women viewed the Same events, one believed intervention was necessary, while the other believed that intervention was adding pressure to an already difficult situation. And when you place that alongside the fact that Meri and Cody were already struggling to communicate, the emotional weight becomes much easier to understand, because the catfishing situation did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a marriage and family system that was already complicated, and changing the online relationship became the story everyone remembered. But the larger question was always what had already been happening before the scandal became public, and that is why the timeline matters so much. Meri had legally divorced Cody in 2014 while still remaining connected to him within the family, and Cody later legally married Robin, and then the catfishing scandal became public in 2015. Some fans looked at that sequence and developed theories about whether the events were connected. But a timeline by itself cannot prove intention or responsibility, and that is something that should remain clear as we examine the story, because the most interesting part is not pretending that an unproven theory is fact. It is understanding why people continue to ask questions about it years later. And there is another name that repeatedly appears in discussions surrounding this period: Robin's friend Kendra. And according to the long-standing theory, some fans believed Kendra knew more about the online relationship than the public originally understood, but the material itself makes clear that this part comes from off-screen commentary and speculation rather than something confirmed by the show, and that distinction is critical because it changes the story from a proven conspiracy into an unresolved question that has continued to circulate among viewers. But even without proving that theory, the information Meri shared about her private conversations with Robin is enough to explain why trust became such a major issue, because when a relationship is already fragile, even small moments of uncertainty can become enormous. And Meri was not only dealing with the confusion surrounding the online person she believed she knew, she was also dealing with the consequences inside her family, and with the way the entire situation changed how people looked at her. And that is where the story becomes much more emotional, because for years, the catfishing scandal was used as a simple explanation for the collapse of Meri and Cody's marriage. But the more context we examine, the harder it becomes to reduce their entire relationship to one event. Meri had previously explained that problems existed long before the scandal, and that means the online relationship may have been a turning point without necessarily being the original cause. And if that is true, then the real story is not about one shocking moment at all. It is about years of distance, misunderstandings, and unresolved emotions building. The full story may never be known, but Meri has raised questions fans still cannot ignore, so subscribe now, because there is always more to uncover.